Welcome to Historica. Join me as we explore fascinating stories from the past and uncover hidden truths. Unmasking Hitler. Debunking the biggest myths. Welcome to the first episode of our new podcast. Today, we will embark on a journey through history, focusing on a figure who has been the subject of many myths and legends over the centuries, Adolf Hitler, the leader of the Third Reich. Although many years have passed since his death, his life and deeds continue to stir up great emotion and controversy. Hitler has become the subject of countless jokes, anecdotes, and films, and the image we have of him today has little to do with the real man. Instead of solid facts, we are presented with fragmented biographical information, a handful of characteristic features and gestures, and a recognizable Chaplin-style moustache and haircut. Much of what we hear about him is merely a product of mass culture, transformed into myths and comedic images that distance us from reality. What does the average person really know about Hitler? That he was a homosexual, an alien, a medium, or perhaps a person possessed by demons, or that he was paranoid or addicted to drugs. Many people also believe he had Jewish roots. At least half of the public thinks so. Few have seen his paintings, but all agree that he was an average artist. Although we know the circumstances of his death, some say he died earlier than is commonly believed. In these beliefs, there is often more fiction than truth. In this episode, we will examine not only the facts, but also the myths surrounding one of the most dangerous men in history, one of the most feared dictators of the 20th century. His story serves as a warning because history tends to repeat itself. I invite you to join me on this journey to discover the true face of Adolf Hitler and to find answers to questions that continue to fascinate and disturb. I hope you will be with us every step of the way on this exciting expedition. Chapter 1. The Legend of Hitler's Jewish Lineage. Whenever a biography is written about a figure who left a profound mark on history, the author typically begins by exploring the subject's genealogy. This is a sensible approach, as personal qualities, beliefs, and views, indeed, much of a person's later biography, are shaped by the environment in which they were born and raised. In this process, researchers often seek as many details as possible, going back as far as they can. This is especially true for the biographers of Adolf Hitler, driven not least by the fact that the future dictator came from a relatively unremarkable family that left little trace in history. As a result, there are numerous gaps in his family history, which have led to the rise of various myths. One of the most persistent myths is that Hitler had Jewish ancestry, a rumor that began circulating during his lifetime. The idea that the greatest enemy of the Jews might himself have been part Jewish served several purposes. First, it captured the imagination of the public, and later became a fascinating subject for those who enjoy historical intrigue. Second, for Hitler's rivals, including some within the National Socialist movement, this rumor was a way to discredit him. How can a proponent of Aryan purity be a secret Jew? Third, it fueled psychological theories, suggesting that Hitler's alleged Jewish background caused him to overcompensate by becoming a fanatical German nationalist and anti-Semite. The idea of Hitler the Jew has also been embraced by modern revisionists and anti-Semites, who argue that if the architect of the Holocaust was himself Jewish, then Jews are somehow to blame for their own suffering. We'll address this claim in more detail later. For now, let's investigate whether there is any basis to the rumors about Hitler's supposed Jewish heritage. If Hitler's genealogy had been as well documented as was later required of SS members, this myth would likely have faded into obscurity. But due to the many gaps in his family history, speculation has persisted. The story goes that Hitler's father, Alois Schicklgruber, was the illegitimate son of a servant who worked in the household of the Rothschild family. According to some sources, one of the Rothschilds had a romantic relationship with her, which led to the birth of Alois. Adolf's grandmother later married Johann Georg Hitler, who is said by some to have descended from a wealthy family of Czech Jews. Alois later adopted the surname Hitler after his stepfather. Adolf's mother, Clara Pölzl, is also sometimes speculated to have had Jewish roots. Supporters of the theory that Hitler had Jewish ancestry present a number of arguments, though many of them fall into the realm of fiction. They claim that persistent rumours must be based on some truth. Moreover, they point to Hitler's actions upon coming to power, when he supposedly worked to suppress investigations into his genealogy and, according to rumours, destroyed key documents. Not all of these claims are baseless. In 1928, the Austrian police reportedly conducted an investigation that concluded Hitler's grandfather was Jewish. A similar conclusion was reached by a top-secret Harvard study in 1943. British historian David Irving also compiled evidence supporting this theory. However, most of the documents Irving used are secondary sources, often little more than records of rumours. Ironically, the myth of Hitler's Jewish ancestry has taken on a life of its own, growing more persistent as Hitler's political influence grew. Even Hitler himself contributed to this mystery. In the 1920s, as head of the nascent Nazi Party, he carefully obscured his origins. In his autobiographical book, Mein Kampf, he devotes only a few lines to his parents. "My father was a conscientious government official, and my mother was a devoted housewife who loved all her children equally." This sparse description did little to dispel curiosity about his background. One biographer, Werner Maaser, suggests that Hitler, well versed in Greek and Roman mythology, deliberately kept his origins vague to emulate ancient heroes whose divine or mysterious parentage elevated them above ordinary mortals. Whether or not this is true, Hitler's enigmatic background only fueled speculation as his political power grew. On October 14, 1933, the Daily Mail published a sensational photo of a tombstone in a Jewish cemetery in Bucharest. According to the article, this was the grave of Adolf Hitler's grandfather. The story made headlines worldwide, seeming to confirm the Jewish origin of the Nazi leader. However, it was soon revealed that this Jewish Hitler had been born only 5 years before Adolf's father, making the connection impossible. After Hitler's suicide in 1945, more rumours emerged, including the so-called Frank memoirs. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of Poland during World War II, wrote after his capture that Hitler's Jewish ancestry was an open secret. Frank's claims have been touted as strong evidence, though many historians doubt their validity. But what does the evidence really tell us? It's widely accepted that Adolf Hitler's father was Alois Hitler, and his mother was Clara Pölzl, his third wife. Beyond that, the facts become murky. Alois Hitler was born illegitimate and carried his mother's surname, Schicklgruber, for the first 39 years of his life. He was only officially adopted by Johann Georg Hitler in 1876, though Hitler had been married to Alois's mother since 1842. The delay in this adoption raises questions. Why wait so long? And why did Hitler eventually decide to recognize Alois as his son? One plausible theory is that Johann Georg Hitler wasn't Alois's biological father at all, but rather his brother, Johann Nepomuk Hitler, who cared for Alois during his childhood. Nepomuk was well off and may have secretly fathered Alois. To avoid scandal, he may have arranged for his brother to marry Maria Anna Schicklgruber, and later adopted Alois under his brother's name. Though this theory isn't proven, it's more plausible than claims of Jewish ancestry. In fact, there is no historical record of any Jewish families with the surname Hitler or Hitler. Thus, the persistent rumours about Hitler's Jewish heritage are largely unsubstantiated. Ultimately, whether or not Hitler had Jewish ancestry is irrelevant. What matters is that he was directly responsible for the murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, including 1.5 million children. His actions, not his origins, define the legacy of one of history's most infamous dictators. Chapter 2. The Illusion of Talent, Hitler's Artistic Aspirations. As children, we often categorize people as good or bad. We believed that a good person was inherently perfect, devoid of any flaws, while a bad person was composed entirely of negative traits. This black and white thinking tends to fade with age, especially regarding those close to us, friends, family, and colleagues. However, our views on historical figures usually remain strictly binary. A positive hero must have no flaws, while an infernal villain should possess no positive qualities. When they do, they cease to be seen as either. This simplistic worldview is reflected in artistic representations and can be dangerous in historical narratives. Viewing history through a child's lens prevents us from analysing events meaningfully or drawing valuable lessons. This tendency is often evident in discussions about the Third Reich and Hitler. He is not only accused of numerous crimes, but is also portrayed as a talentless individual. His failed career in the arts provides a convenient opportunity for such portrayals. Few people have seen Hitler's paintings, and reproductions are rarely available in galleries. Nonetheless, discussions often follow the principle of, I haven't seen them, but I condemn them. Various authors claim Hitler created expressive, cold watercolour postcards and generally lacked talent. This reasoning is understandable. The idea that a villain of such magnitude could produce anything constructive contradicts human logic, much like the traditional portrayal of Emperor Nero as mediocre. We cannot evaluate the quality of Nero's singing, and only a few excerpts of his poetry survive. However, Hitler's works are accessible. Historians attribute around 3,400 paintings, sketches, and drawings to him, all available online, unlike Nazi symbols, which are banned. Reviews from those who saw Hitler's paintings before he became a prominent figure reveal contradictory assessments. Hitler's stubbornness, inherited from his father, led to frequent assertions that both sides would not back down. His father forbade him from pursuing an education in art, prompting Hitler to declare that if he couldn't study art, he wouldn't study anything at all. In his memoirs, Hitler often dramatized situations and was disingenuous. The conflict with his father was not as profound as he claimed, and he continued to practice drawing by sketching landscapes. A long-desired opportunity awaited him, enrolling in the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. By then, his father had died, leaving him financially stable. In 1907, he headed to the Austro-Hungarian capital with high hopes. Hitler arrived in Vienna with optimistic dreams, but his expectations were unmet. He passed the first part of the entrance exam, submitting 2 sketches, but failed the second part, lacking sufficient drawings of plaster models. The exam results stated that he would not become an artist, though he showed talent for architecture. The rector of the academy, Sigmund Dahlmann, advised him to consider becoming a draftsman instead of an artist. This stark contrast in opinions showcases how differently people can assess the same artworks. Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologist of the National Socialist Party, praised Hitler's early drawings as indicative of natural talent. This evaluation should be seen as mere flattery. In 1919, When Hitler's watercolours caught the eye of art connoisseur Ferdinand Steger, he received high praise. Much might have changed had Hitler heard such words in Vienna instead of Dahlmann's dismissal. However, it would be an exaggeration to blame Dahlmann for Hitler's rise as a dictator rather than as an artist. The blow to the pride of a young man prone to inflated self-esteem was significant, yet obstacles hindered his artistic ambitions. To enroll in the architecture department, he needed a maturity certificate, which he never obtained due to dropping out of school after quarrelling with his father. Acquiring the certificate would not have been particularly difficult, but Adolf found it beneath his dignity to return to a school he despised. He had grown accustomed to idleness, making systematic work nearly impossible. Following his mother's death, nothing kept him in his hometown. Without a girlfriend and with his younger sister under guardianship, he returned to Vienna, now aiming to become an architect. Hitler later exaggerated his struggles in Vienna, painting a dire picture of his circumstances. However, he was not as impoverished as he claimed. His income from an orphan's pension and savings ranged from 80 to 120 crowns monthly, enough to cover rent and allow for some luxuries. In 1909-1910, he began working as a draftsman and watercolourist, which he later embellished in his memoirs. His financial situation worsened during this time. By early 1910, he faced significant debts, particularly to a usurer named Anton Ziegler. He began to idealize his past and romanticize his youth in Braunau am Inn, viewing it as restrictive and bourgeois. Despite his idealism, he could not escape life's realities, and his experiences in Vienna deepened his disillusionment and fueled his radicalism. Hitler began to see himself as an artist, and this identity became more important than merely being a draftsman. The accumulated frustrations and disappointments intensified his disdain for everything around him, and he found a cathartic outlet in his crude, expressive watercolours filled with grandiose ideas and a bleak sense of destiny. Chapter 3. Military Misconceptions. The Incompetent Führer. The term Bohemian Corporal is often attributed to Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, one of the most prominent military leaders of World War I. This was his reaction to a meeting with Adolf Hitler, the leader of a rising political party, who presented himself as an inconspicuous man with a distinctive moustache and a claim to frontline experience. Why Bohemian? Hitler hailed from Austria, a country that Hindenburg associated with his own youth, particularly the Austro-Prussian War of 1866, which prominently featured events in Bohemia. Hindenburg's words quickly became iconic, frequently cited in discussions regarding Hitler's military leadership. The phrase Bohemian Corporal underscored the perceived amateurism and incompetence of a man who had taken command of a vast army. Indeed, Hitler's military leadership abilities are among the most debated topics in his biography. If we set aside the propaganda from both the Allies and even German sources during the war years, we find numerous accounts from Wehrmacht generals who later chronicled their experiences. Their narratives, while diverse, converged into a singular theme: the enduring myth that Hitler possessed no military capability. This myth can be summarized as follows. Throughout World War II, Hitler directly interfered with military operations, driven by narcissism and a belief that he was more intelligent than professional soldiers. Officers recognized the detrimental impact of his orders, but felt compelled to obey them due to their oaths, even as they lamented their consequences. While the Führer may have had some potential, it was grossly insufficient. By the war's end, Hitler had completely disconnected from reality, refusing to heed advice and issuing orders that lacked purpose. Ultimately, he is portrayed as the individual who obstructed his generals from achieving victory or at least securing a more honourable conclusion for Germany. The motivations of the German generals become clearer in this context. They sought to present themselves in the best possible light. Beyond the desire for self-promotion typical of memoirists, Wehrmacht commanders aimed to demonstrate their utility to their new Western allies, the victors. They claimed that they had nearly defeated the Russians, asserting that Hitler's interference was the reason for their failures. If not for him, they argue, victory in the World War would have been straightforward. This narrative quickly gained traction among Western allies who wished to portray the Soviet Union as conquerable. It resonated with Germans, eager to feel like defenders of Europe against Bolshevism and proud of their army's mission. It also appealed to opponents of Nazism who believed that outright denial of any merit in Hitler was a more principled stance than a careful, analytical approach. In Russia, the narrative of incompetent Hitler, who thwarted his general's victory, gained popularity in the early 1990s amid a re-evaluation of values. It served as a counterpoint to the narrative surrounding incompetent Stalin, who forced soldiers into futile attacks backed by execution squads. This perspective culminated in Karl Reicher's 1955 book, One Man Loses the World War, published in the Federal Republic of Germany. In it, Reicher posits that Germany's defeat stemmed from a series of grave military and political mistakes, almost all of which were directly or indirectly committed by Hitler. The motivations behind this myth are apparent, and we must now assess its validity. To do this, we turn to the source of the myth, the memoirs of German military leaders. Erich von Manstein devoted an entire chapter of his book, Lost Victories, to Hitler's military leadership. He asserts that dismissing Hitler as merely a corporal from World War I overlooks his significant military acumen. Manstein acknowledges that Hitler demonstrated aptitude for analysing operational capabilities. He possessed extensive knowledge, remarkable memory, and a creative imagination in technology and weaponry. His understanding and extraordinary energy contributed to the accelerated development of various arms. However, this belief in his superiority had dire consequences. Hitler's interventions hindered the continuous evolution of the Air Force and delayed advancements in jet engine production and atomic weaponry. While he could grasp operational possibilities, he struggled to assess the prerequisites and feasibility of specific operational concepts. He lacked an understanding of how operational tasks depended on both spatial factors and the need for resources and time, not to mention logistical support. Moreover, Hitler often failed to recognize the proportionality of his ambitions. Following the successes of 1938, he consistently pursued unrealistic goals, which led to a dispersion of German forces across multiple fronts and theatres of war. The defining characteristic of Hitler's leadership was his overestimation of the power of will, his will. He assumed that his determination would compel even the lowest-ranking soldier to validate his decisions, ensuring the success of his orders. This blind conviction led him to disregard the intentions of enemy command and reliable intelligence about enemy superiority. Consequently, his insistence on defending every inch of ground became a central principle of his leadership, resulting in significant German forces becoming encircled. Only through maneuver warfare could the superior command and effectiveness of German troops have been leveraged to weaken Soviet forces. Despite his claims of thinking like a soldier and emphasizing his front-line experience, Hitler's understanding of military realities was superficial. Losses to him were merely statistical indicators of decreased combat effectiveness. They did not resonate on a personal level. These deficiencies could have been mitigated had he been willing to consult his experienced chief of staff, sharing responsibility for military decisions. If he had supplemented his lack of military training and experience with the knowledge and expertise of his chief of staff, Germany might have achieved satisfactory military leadership despite these shortcomings. Instead, Hitler believed that he could better assess the situation from his desk than commanders could in the field, even as his operational maps grew outdated. He increasingly meddled in the management of army groups and armies, issuing direct orders beyond his authority. I will refrain from commenting on this text for now, as I plan to revisit it when examining specific operations of World War II. For the moment, I will make two important introductory remarks relevant to our discussion. First, if we accept that Hitler alone hindered his commanders from winning World War II, we must assume that they would have secured victory without him. History does not recognize the subjunctive mood. We cannot verify hypothetical scenarios. However, history is often seen as a teacher, providing us with precedents. One such example is World War I, where the German military elite held considerable political influence. This culminated in a decision to escalate the July crisis of 1914, leading to widespread conflict. The military within the Great General Staff developed a plan for a rapid campaign, with no one, not even the Emperor, daring to interfere. As the war progressed, military power and influence increased, culminating in Chief of the General Staff Hindenburg's de facto dictatorship over Germany by 1916. The military intervened in all facets of governance, from diplomatic relations to agriculture and social policy. The outcome was a defeat that culminated in the humiliating Treaty of Versailles, with no one to blame but the military. They devised an overly ambitious Schlieffen Plan intended to guarantee a swift victory over France. The military, most notably Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, executed this plan poorly, squandering opportunities for a rapid victory and extending the war into a protracted stalemate. As time progressed, the German command's decisions reflected increasing adventurism. In 1917, the military insisted on declaring unrestricted submarine warfare against all shipping west of Britain, which inevitably drew the United States into the conflict. By late 1917, with Russia exiting the war, the military stubbornly pursued expansive gains instead of negotiating a quick, moderate peace to redirect forces toward the West. Technical misjudgment characterized military leadership as well. They dismissed emerging technologies like tanks as mere novelties. It was only too late that they recognized their oversight, with the first German tanks arriving too late for meaningful impact in World War I. These missteps and shortcomings bear comparison to those attributed to Hitler by Manstein. The German military was not without its faults and eagerly sought to blame others for their failures. The primary distinction between the generals and Hitler is that they accepted defeat before enemy forces reached German soil, thus avoiding a humiliating occupation. It's uncertain how much credit the military deserves for this, given that a revolution in Germany shortly before the armistice contributed to a recognition of defeat. This same revolution would later be blamed by the generals for their defeat, giving rise to the stab-in-the-back myth. They claimed they were on the brink of victory when red traitors staged a mutiny, undermining an undefeated army. In contrast, at the end of World War II, there was no revolution, and the responsibility for defeat was laid at the feet of the Führer. Now, I turn to the second point of my remarks. In today's world, and historically, the head of state assumes the role of supreme commander during wartime. Typically, this individual is a civilian with limited military expertise. Why are they entrusted with such a critical role? The answer lies in the famous words of Clausewitz: war is the continuation of politics by other means. While military leaders undoubtedly possess superior knowledge regarding weaponry and tactics, it's essential to recognize that military action and victory over an enemy are not ends in themselves, but rather means to achieve broader political objectives. Only political leaders can determine how and when to employ these means, including when to initiate a conflict and on what terms to conclude it. Even the course of individual military operations may be influenced more by political considerations than by military strategy. Capturing a city can hold immense symbolic significance, while withdrawing from an area may be strategically prudent, yet economically crucial. In these cases, generals may grumble about political interference, but they must ultimately concede the primacy of political judgment, a lesson that German generals often struggled to accept. Chapter 4. Under the Influence, the Dictator's Drug Dependence. The version of Hitler's drug addiction that has almost become official originates from a very controversial figure known in certain circles, occultist and warlock Aleister Crowley, one of the most prominent figures in esoteric circles during the Silver Age. Crowley claimed that he personally taught Hitler the art of magic, and during this training, introduced the Führer to mescaline and other exotic drugs. However, there is no evidence to support this claim. Crowley never met Hitler, and there is no indication that the leader of the Third Reich used such serious psychoactive substances. Moreover, Hitler was not even affected by the widespread cocaine craze of the 1920s. Some might argue that Hitler's avoidance of drugs was due to his poverty as a young man. In Mein Kampf, he openly complains about his meagre orphan's pension and how he had to live on mere pennies. However, if we look at, for example, Vatinsky's memoirs, it becomes clear that cocaine at the time cost almost as much as sugar, and poverty didn't stop those addicted to it. Thus, it seems more likely that the English magician simply sought fame by associating his name with Europe's most notorious villain. No matter how hard Crowley tried to portray himself as the beast from the abyss, he couldn't outshine Hitler in infamy, despite insinuations about having direct access to occult powers. Nevertheless, an almost official version, circulated by various media outlets, goes something like this. It all began with Wolfram von Eschenbach's poem, Parsifal. At the turn of the century, everything medieval was in vogue in Austria-Hungary and especially in Germany. The Germans were searching for their own roots, forming a national identity after the fragmentation and defeat of the 30 Years' War. This led to a fascination with runes, medieval poems, Norse mythology, and of course Wagner's music, which used these motifs. Consequently, it's not surprising that the young Austrian, Hitler, became interested in such literature. Through this passion, Hitler met a fellow antiquities enthusiast, Viennese bookseller Ernst Pretzscher. Pretzscher, having grown up in the German colony in Mexico City and being the son of a pharmacist, brings mescaline back into the story. It's here that some myths begin to emerge. According to one version, Pretzscher introduced Hitler to the sacred Aztec cactus peyote, which supposedly opened the way to clairvoyance and higher spiritual planes. According to the legend, Hitler wasn't immediately given peyote by Pretzscher, who believed that spiritual preparation was necessary before engaging in such esoteric practices. Around this time, Hitler also met a herbalist, Hans Lotz, who supposedly prepared a peyote infusion for him. It is claimed that Hitler, under the influence of mescaline, underwent his first transcendental experience by the Danube, far from Munich's noise. This esoteric training supposedly helped him maintain control over his mind during such experiences, allowing him to delve into visions of his past lives and grandiose ideas about his role in history. According to this narrative, Hitler's visions, far from being blissful, were driven by his intense and psychopathic mind. His mystical journey allegedly revealed bits of his past reincarnations and reinforced his belief that Parsifal was a prophetic document of great magical power, foretelling events of the 20th century. In Hitler's eyes, the characters of the Grail legend were set to reincarnate in modern times, with himself as the heir to the Grail Knight. Further elaboration of the myth suggests that the atrocities of Nazism, the concentration camps, gas chambers, and the final solution were not merely crimes against humanity, but ritualistic sacrifices, echoing the bloody practices of the Aztecs. Just as the Aztecs offered human sacrifices to their gods, the Nazis supposedly engaged in their own version of this ancient rite, with their swastika and runic symbols as signs of neo-paganism rooted in both Nordic mythology and the Aztec cult of blood. This is where mescaline reappears as a tool for contacting transcendental realms, misunderstood by those seeking sensationalist tales. Such stories, filled with references to reincarnation and Aztec rituals, provide no real evidence because there is none. These legends are designed for a gullible audience hungry for shocking revelations. In reality, no matter how negatively we view Hitler, he had a logical mind, and there is no indication that he sought to cloud his consciousness with chemicals. Another myth claims that Hitler was an alcoholic, though again, there is almost no evidence. He avoided wine not due to convictions, but because of a youthful incident where he drank too much and ended up in an embarrassing situation. This led him to swear off alcohol for good. However, he did allow himself beer on occasion, so he wasn't an absolute abstainer. Tobacco was another matter. Hitler was a fanatical opponent of smoking, forbidding it in his presence and ridiculing those who smoked, especially Hermann Goering and Heinrich Hoffmann. Yet, some basis for the Hitler the drug addict myth can be found, specifically in the actions of his personal physician, Dr. Theo Morell, during World War II. Morell, a skin and venereal disease specialist, met Hitler in 1936 and began treating him for various ailments, which included abdominal pain and other symptoms. Over time, Morell expanded the number of drugs he prescribed to Hitler, which led to a medical spiral. Hitler became increasingly dependent on Morell's treatments, which eventually included potent stimulants like choramine and Pervitin, an early form of methamphetamine. As Hitler's health worsened, especially after the failed assassination attempt in 1944, his dependency on these drugs deepened. Biographers describe his condition as deteriorating. His left side shook, his movements slowed, and his coordination suffered. Despite the growing number of medications and stimulants he took, Hitler's war efforts were doomed. The legend of Hitler the drug addict is therefore based on his late-stage dependence on Morell's treatments. While his health had already deteriorated by the end of the war, this drug addiction likely had little influence on the larger events. By that time, the Third Reich was on the brink of defeat, and no matter who was leading it, whether a drug-addled dictator or a young athlete, the outcome was inevitable. Chapter 5. The Nazi Leader. Sexual Myths and Public Perception. Hitler's sexual myth is not a single myth, but a complex of rumours and speculations. The most popular and persistent among them are the legends about the Führer's perverse passions, such as sadomasochism, his impotence, and homosexuality. But let's begin with the more traditional stories. Was Hitler successful with women? The topic of his relationships with the opposite sex has intrigued many. How is it that someone as unmasculine, short, and physically unimposing as Adolf Hitler became a sex symbol for an entire nation? What must women have felt, seeking intimacy with him? dreaming of even a single touch from the self-proclaimed Messiah of Germany. Why was this villain, this warmonger, considered desirable and attractive to so many women? This image contradicts the portrayal of Hitler in Allied war propaganda, leading to widespread speculation and rumours. Let's try to sort this out. First and foremost, it must be said that Hitler was indeed fortunate with women. They surrounded him throughout his life, cared for him, and even helped him find sources of funding for his grandiose projects and establish key business contacts. Courteous, charming, and adept at reading people, Hitler was skilled at recognizing what fascinated or excited his interlocutors, and could effortlessly steer conversations in a way that resonated with them. Naturally, this made him attractive to many women. Hitler willingly accepted their admiration and assistance. It can be argued that much of his power rested on this adulation from women, which may explain why some have suggested that the Nazi rise to power was partly due to the votes of female supporters. In truth, few political figures of the 20th century could boast of the same level of popularity with the opposite sex as Adolf Hitler. He received countless letters offering physical intimacy, so many that he could never have read them all in a lifetime. Exalted young women dreamed of bearing his children. Emil Maurice, Hitler's chauffeur, recalled how young girls would sometimes throw themselves in front of his car, hoping that an injury would result in personal attention from Hitler. From all over Germany, women in love with him sent handmade gifts. Most often, these were simple items like pillows embroidered with flowers, leaves, and swastikas. But the sheer volume of these tokens demonstrated the depth of devotion many women felt toward their leader. Yet, despite his ability to inspire such passion, Hitler was often quite restrained in his personal relationships with women. His strict Protestant upbringing played a role. In public, he recharged himself on the energy of crowds of adoring women, becoming intoxicated by their emotional outpourings. He was adept at creating a kind of emotional resonance, stirring a real physical desire in them. However, he rarely took things further with these admirers. When faced with offers of intimacy that did not suit him, he often responded with the cryptic phrase, "My bride is Germany." This has led to various, sometimes scandalous or sensational interpretations. Historians and pseudo-historians have speculated that Hitler's restraint, even coldness in sexual matters, could be attributed to reasons ranging from syphilis contracted in childhood or a wound suffered during World War I, to rumours of his non-traditional sexual orientation or peculiar preferences in bed. However, the discrepancy between his public image and his private behaviour is not so difficult to understand. Those close to Hitler noted his extraordinary acting abilities. He was a master of crafting the image that suited the moment. Before a crowd of women, he could embody sexuality. Among Prussian generals, he was the model of discipline and determination. With soldiers, he was a comrade from the front lines. And in official settings, he mirrored his own carefully constructed portrait. In other words, at the helm of the most powerful country in Europe was a talented self-taught actor, capable of playing any role. It should be emphasized that Hitler genuinely loved women, not as a womanizer, but in the sense that he understood and appreciated German women. He recognized their strengths and weaknesses, and seemed to sense their desires and aspirations. However, one type of woman did disgust him: female agitators, female politicians who, in his view, were embittered, masculine, and unfulfilled in their personal lives. This type of woman, born out of World War I and the subsequent revolution, was, in Hitler's mind, the result of the war's devastating impact on Germany's male population. With fewer men capable of fathering children, some women sublimated their sexual energy into politics, becoming the revolutionary fanatics and party activists that Hitler and the National Socialists scorned. The Nazis regarded these women with contempt, not considering them true women. A judge, a soldier, and a leader of the state must be and remain men, declared the party's chief theorist, Alfred Rosenberg, a sentiment Hitler fully endorsed. "A woman in politics disgusts me," he once remarked with conviction. Nevertheless, Hitler understood the power of women to inspire men to greatness. He knew that many Nazi supporters, such as General Erich Ludendorff, were heavily influenced by their wives, without whose support they might not have achieved much. Therefore, despite his desire to steer German culture back to a more patriarchal model, Hitler acknowledged that women could, in some cases, step outside the traditional realms of children, kitchen, and church. Hitler despised the kind of emancipation that was prevalent in Germany at the time, but women's sports like car racing, bicycle races, and parachuting competitions were not banned in the Third Reich, although they were not as heavily promoted as they had been in the 1920s. Although Hitler often made dismissive remarks like, "If a woman in Saxony starts thinking about why she was born, that's a problem," or "A ladle is a woman's weapon," he frequently consulted accomplished women in various fields. For example, Leni Riefenstahl became the Reich's chief documentarian, and architect Gerdy Troost oversaw the reconstruction of buildings in Obersalzberg. Hitler also had a particular admiration for many German actresses, who often attracted him. However, Nazi propaganda was not focused on these exceptional women, but on the masses, those who lived outside major cities and were untouched by the poison of emancipation. Women from rural Germany, the heartland, also adored Hitler. He understood their values and dreams. "They don't aspire to work in factories, offices, or parliament," he once said. "Their hearts lie in their homes, with their husbands and children." In this, he was absolutely right. Most German women did not seek careers in politics or science, nor did they dream of becoming actresses or race car drivers. After years of post-war economic hardship, many saw Hitler as their savior, a man who had rescued them from crushing poverty. When they had the opportunity to see him in person, even from afar, he became an idealized figure, an idol. Hitler's personal life, however, was far less exciting than the legends suggest. Despite his political success, he was not a successful lover. Most of his romantic relationships ended tragically. In this context, his relationship with Eva Braun could be considered his most stable and fulfilling, providing him with a few years of relative peace and something that resembled family happiness. Chapter 6. Magic of the Führer, a historical enigma. Adolf Hitler has often been described as a medium. People today, shaped by materialism, may find his actions perplexing. However, those familiar with the occult sciences may not be surprised. What seems strange to the average observer is often clear to those initiated in such matters. Such claims are abundant on the internet and in sensational books about Hitler. This should not be surprising, as it reflects a broader trend. What is surprising, however, is that similar, albeit less absurd, thoughts occasionally appear in reputable works by leading figures in German historiography. This phenomenon has led to the creation of two myths regarding Hitler's demonic power. The first myth is perpetuated mainly by journalists who discuss the Führer's alleged connection to otherworldly forces. The second is propagated by professional historians, particularly those who write biographies of Hitler, incorporating elements of the supernatural when describing his personality and his influence on both individuals and the masses. Despite the significant differences between these two myths, they support and complement one another. I have chosen to combine them in one chapter because they both address a critical question. How did a simple corporal manage to become the head of a powerful state and achieve the unquestioning obedience of tens of millions? These myths answer this question through the lens of irrational explanations. First, let us examine the myth that directly addresses Hitler's connection to occult forces. Entire books have been written on this subject, many of which sell in large print runs. Among the most widespread legends is that Hitler was a medium manipulated by an experienced black magician, often identified as Karl Haushofer. However, this sorcerer's apprentice eventually escaped his teacher's control. Proponents of this theory cite testimonies from Hitler's contemporaries, who often used the term medium in a metaphorical sense. The occult myths also include tales of a secret SS order that allegedly preserved ancient magical religions, performed rituals involving dark forces, and conjured demons. To complete this sensational narrative, one might expect to hear about a Loch Ness monster, adorned with a swastika, attacking convoys travelling from the USA to Britain. It goes without saying that the facts presented in these stories are largely figments of imagination. Inventing captivating tales about Hitler's Germany has proven to be quite a lucrative endeavour, explaining their proliferation. The same holds true for the numerous narratives suggesting Nazi connections with aliens and flying saucers that supposedly roamed the Third Reich. However, the myth concerning Tibetan monks who allegedly supported National Socialism with their ancient traditions has some basis. According to these mythmakers, the monks arrived in Berlin alongside a certain Schaefer, who led an expedition to Tibet in 1938-1939, and later became one of the Führer's closest associates. There are claims that Hitler maintained constant contact with a Tibetan monk, referred to as the Keeper of the Key, who allegedly wore green gloves. On April 25, 1945, Soviet soldiers reportedly discovered 6 Tibetans lying in a circle in a Berlin basement, with a figure in green gloves at the centre. Hitler was said to have surrounded himself with Tibetans of high status. It was purported that not even a Wehrmacht colonel could sit in their presence. In May 1945, these Tibetans fought to the last bullet, executing their wounded rather than surrendering. However, no living Tibetan in SS uniform remained. In the last days of April 1945, Soviet soldiers indeed encountered dead SS men with distinct Asian features. But these were not members of national formations from among the citizens of the USSR. Rather, they belonged to the French SS division, Charlemagne, comprised of colonial soldiers from Indochina. Perhaps some of these unfortunate soldiers wore green gloves, but none had any ties to Tibet. At this point, we can conclude our discussion of occult myths and turn to the works of more serious researchers who ascribe to Hitler a demonic gift for influencing people. This approach raises the question, why is this necessary? Is it to simplify the explanation of the phenomenon of National Socialism? We are talking about esteemed academics who have made significant contributions to historical scholarship, not mere novices. The answer lies elsewhere. In one of his novels, Erich Maria Remarque articulated a sentiment prevalent in post-war Germany. Once Germany capitulated, there would be no Nazis left, only unfortunate Germans deceived by Hitler. Indeed, the first few decades following the war in the Federal Republic of Germany were characterized by a collective desire to forget, as the period of National Socialism was declared an aberration, entirely uncharacteristic of German history. Many sought to quickly forget the Third Reich, and when this was impossible, some attempted to place the blame solely on one individual, Hitler. This effort was especially fervent among older generations, that had previously coexisted comfortably with the regime. Renowned historian Gerhard Ritter, while discussing Hitler's satanic nature and demonic qualities, sought to contrast him with the traditions of the German people, which he believed were fundamentally incompatible with Nazism. Many others echoed this sentiment, striving to answer two critical questions negatively. Is there continuity between earlier periods of German history and the Third Reich? Are the German people and their various groups culpable for the crimes of National Socialism? The concept of a demonic essence allowed for a reasoned no to both questions. How could current and past generations of Germans be held accountable for the emergence of a man with supernatural persuasive powers? Proponents of the irrational thesis rely on numerous testimonies regarding Hitler's influence on both large crowds and small groups, claiming that his gift of persuasion bordered on the mystical. They argue he could convince any audience, regardless of size, of the validity of his ideas, even inducing a state of religious ecstasy. Does the ability to persuade someone aware of the dire situation at the front about an inevitable victory not suggest some supernatural gift? In my view, no. It suffices to possess strong psychological acumen, effective oratorical skills, and an understanding of what one's audience wishes to hear. Hitler excelled in this regard. In front of ordinary crowds, he spoke of Germany's greatness and the well-being of its citizens. In small groups of industrial magnates, he discussed military contracts and new markets. In conversations with military leaders, he spoke of miraculous weapons that would ensure victory. The absence of supernatural powers is evident in numerous instances where he failed to convince his interlocutors. Returning to our main inquiry, we must consider whether Nazism was truly an anomaly in German history and if Hitler's rise was solely due to supernatural gifts. Regrettably for many Germans, the answer to both questions is negative. It is essential to note that Hitler's ideas were not original. He often merely brought existing ideas to their logical conclusions. Take, for example, anti-Semitism. Animosity towards Jews has existed in Europe since early Christianity. Jews lived in segregated ghettos, and dreadful rumours circulated about them, including the infamous blood libel. In the 19th century, anti-Semitism was prevalent in the German states, and an anti-Semitic party emerged in the late 1800s, securing a small yet stable representation in the Reichstag. While not all Germans were anti-Semites, animosity towards Jews was widespread. This is why the Jewish community in Germany enthusiastically welcomed the outbreak of World War I, seeing it as an opportunity to prove their loyalty to the German fatherland. This initiative failed miserably, as the conservative military establishment held strong anti-Semitic sentiments. The belief that Jews were responsible for Germany's defeat became prevalent, along with the idea that all leftist movements were driven by a Jewish conspiracy to seize power. Hitler seized upon these existing sentiments and distilled them into the simple phrase, "The Jews are to blame for everything." Similarly, the theory of racial superiority was not Hitler's invention. Throughout history, civilizations have perceived themselves as beacons of light surrounded by darkness. In Europe, this idea gained scientific credence in the 19th century, notably through the works of Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, who published On the Inequality of the Human Races. In it, he argued for the superiority of one race over others, specifically asserting that the dominant branch of the white race was the German branch, warning against racial mixing. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, an Englishman who married Wagner's daughter and became an ardent admirer of all things German, further popularized these ideas in his 1899 book, Foundations of the 19th Century. He contrasted the creative Teutonic principle with the destructive Jewish principle, and promoted the concept of the Aryan race, which Hitler later adopted. While neither Gobineau nor Chamberlain directly advocated for the extermination of inferior races, the broader context of dehumanization, exemplified by the Nazi program of euthanasia, targeting the mentally ill and disabled, was pervasive in early 20th century Europe. In 1920, two reputable professors published a book titled Permission to Destroy Life Unworthy of Existence, arguing that mentally ill individuals and those with severe incurable conditions were unworthy of living. Their views were not unique. Similar ideologies were gaining traction across Europe. The rejection of the Treaty of Versailles was a crucial aspect that Hitler exploited to further his ascent. This sentiment resonated across nearly all political parties. However, those in power during the Weimar Republic, liberals, social democrats, and members of the Centre Party, could not overtly promote it, as they had been signatories to the treaty. This situation allowed them to be branded as traitors, obscuring the fact that those responsible for the war were not the ones who signed the treaty, and that, in 1919, Germany had already been defeated. With his background in the German Workers' Party, Hitler skillfully harnessed these feelings, which had been further intensified by the Great Depression. As Germany descended into a crisis of enormous proportions, the Nazis took advantage of the nation's resentment and despair, presenting their program as a solution to Germany's woes. In light of all these observations, it is evident that Hitler was neither a medium nor a demonic figure, but a man deeply influenced by the historical context of his time. He utilized the existing beliefs and prejudices of the German populace, transforming them into a destructive political force. The notion of Hitler as a unique, demonic individual serves more to absolve collective responsibility than to provide a genuine understanding of the factors leading to the rise of National Socialism. Ultimately, he was an ambitious politician adept at harnessing the prevalent sentiments of his era. Chapter 7. Gold as Leverage. The Nazis' Economic Power. An open terrorist dictatorship, fascism represents the regressive, chauvinistic, and imperialist aspects of finance capital. It is not a supraclass power, nor does it emerge from the petty bourgeoisie or lumpen proletariat's control over finance capital. Rather, fascism embodies the power of finance capital itself, organized to enact terrorist reprisals against the working class and the revolutionary segments of the peasantry and intelligentsia. In its most blatant form, fascism promotes a zoological hatred of other peoples through its foreign policy. Churchill famously stated that fascism was the shadow or ugly child of communism. This idea was adopted by proponents of the concept of totalitarianism, who sought to demonstrate the consubstantiality of communism and National Socialism based on their apparent similarities. National Socialism can be seen as a revolt of the masses, for which big capital bears no responsibility. Two contrasting viewpoints and myths exist regarding the relationship between Hitler and big capital. One myth asserts that Hitler was merely a tool of big capital, while another contends that German business played a negligible role in his rise to power and was generally opposed to Nazism. We must now examine where the truth lies. In Germany, businesses traditionally financed the so-called bourgeois parties. Entrepreneurs subsidized conservative, liberal, and Catholic centre parties. However, in the Kaiser's Germany, this financing did not prevent the rapid rise of social democracy. This illustrates that while money significantly influences political struggle, it is not the sole factor. After Germany's defeat in World War I and the subsequent revolution, businesses were primarily focused on preventing the far left from gaining power. During this period, various paramilitary organizations and volunteer corps were actively funded to restore order and protect the interests of traditional elites. In the early 1920s, the threat of revolution remained acute. Germany was mired in economic crisis, and a significant portion of the population was dissatisfied with the new government. Thus, it was logical for businesses to finance forces actively opposing the Red threat, including right-wing radical parties. The NSDAP was one of these parties. In its initial years, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, was a small Bavarian party among many similar parties in Germany. Consequently, it was mainly funded by local Bavarian capital, which was primarily medium-sized rather than large. Notably, in October 1923, just before the beer hall putsch, Fritz Thyssen, a major figure in German heavy industry, provided Hitler with a substantial sum of 100,000 gold marks. Hermann Göring, a new supporter of the National Socialists with strong connections among the elite, played a significant role in facilitating Hitler's access to the economic elite. The failure of the coup attempt in Munich in November 1923, known as the beer hall putsch, resulted in a temporary decline of the National Socialists. Hitler was imprisoned, and the party experienced disarray. The socialist wing, led by the Strasser brothers, gained strength, actively employing anti-capitalist rhetoric. The term socialist in the party's name had previously raised skepticism among business representatives, and these connections were now in jeopardy. Additionally, an economic upswing began in 1924, diminishing interest in radical parties from both voters and serious sponsors. Upon his release at the end of 1924, Hitler confronted a bleak reality. The party had effectively fallen apart. Internal conflicts were rampant, and elections to the Reichstag yielded no significant successes. During the next few years, he worked diligently to unify the party, asserting his role as its undisputed leader. All separatists were either coerced into compliance or ruthlessly purged from the NSDAP. These years were crucial for the party's development, laying the groundwork for future successes, despite modest growth in voter support prior to the economic crisis. In addition to consolidating his position as the Führer, Hitler faced severe financial challenges within the National Socialist Party. These difficulties were partially alleviated by a sympathetic owner of a Munich printing house, Müller, and by the support of Saxon industrialist Mutschmann, who connected the Nazis with other colleagues and provided limited funding. However, this was insufficient to meet the party's needs for propaganda and maintaining its paramilitary forces. To secure sponsorship, Hitler embarked on a series of trips across the country, engaging with representatives of the German business elite. His main focus was the Ruhr region, the heart of German heavy industry. The coal and steel magnates traditionally held right-wing political sympathies and were keen on strengthening Germany's international standing and securing large military contracts. Hitler promised these industrialists the repudiation of the Versailles Treaty, the establishment of a strong military, and the suppression of Reds and trade unions. He sought to reassure his audience that the term socialist in the party's name was primarily a tactic to attract voters, and that no measures would be taken to expropriate significant property if the NSDAP came to power. The party advocated for harmony between labour and capital, and it regarded private property as sacred, just as the industrial magnates did. Hitler's speeches were well received, however funding was still lacking. The traditional right-wing parties, the National People's Party of Germany and the National German Party, were more favoured by most captains of the economy, leading to a situation where the NSDAP was treated as junior partners primarily needed to siphon off votes from the Communists and Social Democrats. The financing of the NSDAP occurred on a residual basis. While Nazi propaganda claimed that the party was solely funded by ordinary voters' contributions and was entirely independent of big business, this was a significant distortion of reality. Hitler was not merely a puppet of big monopoly capital. He made considerable efforts to convince these capitalists of his party's utility. A pivotal moment occurred during a meeting in the summer of 1927 between Hitler and Emil Kirdorf, the head of the Ruhr Mining Association. The 4.5-hour conversation led Kirdorf to request that Hitler articulate his ideas in writing. Subsequently, Kirdorf circulated a printed brochure of Hitler's proposals to numerous business leaders in the Weimar Republic. Hitler endeavored to demonstrate his integrity. Many aspects of the party program, which had initially featured anti-capitalist elements, such as the confiscation of large landed estates, were softened, often suggesting that such measures would only target Jewish capital. Notably, the Nazis would explicitly declare their opposition to strikes as a weapon of class struggle by 1930. In pursuit of alliances, Hitler collaborated with conservative forces, notably the National German People's Party of Hugenberg. In 1929, they united against the Young Reparations Plan. In this alliance, the Nazis accepted the role of junior partners in exchange for significant financial resources, with Hugenberg agreeing to allocate every fifth mark received by his party fund to the Nazis, an amount estimated at around 2 million marks annually. Hitler declared to his associates, "An alliance with the National Party is advantageous because we can utilize their rich sources of money. While drawing from them, we must simultaneously conduct our struggle as if it were our own business." The Nazis might have remained junior partners for an extended period, gathering scraps from their patrons, had it not been for the global economic crisis that erupted at the end of 1929, commonly referred to as the Great Depression. This crisis severely impacted Germany, which had not yet fully recovered from previous upheavals and continued to pay reparations to the victors. Millions found themselves unemployed, filled with resentment toward the system and eager to support any radical political force that promised them sustenance and employment. The middle class faced decline, confronting poverty and ruin. Big capital also suffered substantial losses, making the National Socialist ideas increasingly appealing. This shift became evident during the September 1930 elections to the Reichstag. Compared to their performance 2 years prior, the National Socialists significantly increased their vote share, capturing more than 100 parliamentary mandates. In contrast, traditional right-wing parties suffered losses. This shift eliminated the notion of the Nazis as junior partners. The NSDAP's successes prompted big business to re-evaluate its stance on the party, which promised order, prosperity, and an end to class conflict. The rise of the Communists further compelled the ruling elite to view Hitler's party as the sole force capable of countering the Red threat, leading to increased funding. Following the 1930 elections, subsidies from large industry began to flow into the party's coffers. Notable figures such as Flick, Schroeder, Tyson and Schacht were among those who began investing in Hitler. This marked the beginning of a positive feedback loop between the NSDAP and big business. Increased funding enabled more effective election campaigns, attracting more voters, which in turn made the party a more attractive investment for entrepreneurs. In January 1930, at the initiative of Kirdorf, funds began to flow into Hitler's party from the so-called Ruhr treasure, which involved a contribution of 5 pfennigs from every ton of coal sold, amounting to approximately 6 million marks annually. The Rhine-Westphalian Industrial Group contributed at least 1 million marks to the NSDAP treasury from 1931 to 1932. Simultaneously, voices of dissent emerged within the party, accusing Hitler of betraying socialism. Notably, Otto Strasser, a prominent party figure, expressed concern over Hitler's direction. In response, Hitler attempted to convince him of the legitimacy of his strategy, engaging in lengthy discussions. When Strasser directly questioned what Hitler would do with the Krupp firm upon gaining power, Hitler assured him, "It goes without saying. Do you really think I am trying to destroy German heavy industry?" He further asserted, "Our entrepreneurs owe their position to their abilities. This selection, which confirms their belonging to the superior race, grants them the right to lead." Strasser was unconvinced and eventually opposed Hitler, attempting to form a rival organization, although this effort was unsuccessful. During 1931-1932, the economic crisis intensified. The decline in production, rising unemployment, and the state's evident inability to address these catastrophic developments favoured both the National Socialists and their nemesis, the Communist Party of Germany. An increasing number of ordinary citizens and members of the political and economic elite began to believe that supporting the Nazis was the only way to avert Bolshevik chaos. In the summer of 1931, Otto Dietrich, head of the NSDAP press department, recalled, "The Führer decided to focus on systematically courting influential industrial magnates. Conspiracy was essential to avoid jeopardizing the cause, so we restricted access to information for the press. Our efforts bore fruit." In January 1932, Hitler addressed the Industrial Club in Düsseldorf, where he spoke before representatives of Germany's industrial concerns and banks. His ideas resonated with the audience, leading to a significant influx of funds into the party's treasury. In the spring of 1932, Hitler's supporters among the industrial elite formed the so-called Kepler Circle, which later evolved into the Society of Himmler's Friends. The purpose of the Kepler Circle was not only to finance the Nazi Party, but also to control its economic program. Hitler, however, was not opposed to meeting the wishes of his sponsors, a sentiment he clearly expressed at the first meeting of the Circle. The materials from the Nuremberg Tribunal provide crucial information regarding the sources of financing for the NSDAP. Hjalmar Schacht, the former head of the Reichsbank and Minister of Economics from 1934 to 1937, played a pivotal role in financially supporting National Socialism. He recounted an exchange with US prosecutor Robert Jackson, revealing that Hitler needed funds for his election campaign scheduled for March 5th. Schacht recounted, "Goering gathered all these individuals, and I made a speech. Perhaps it cannot be called a speech since Hitler spoke. I asked them to indicate how much money they could contribute to the election. They collectively subscribed a total of 3 million marks, which they distributed among themselves. They were all bankers and industrialists, representing the chemical, metallurgical, and textile industries. In fact, all branches of industry. The National Socialists achieved their greatest successes in the presidential and parliamentary elections in the spring and summer of 1932. In the presidential election, Hitler garnered more than 13 million votes, and in the parliamentary elections, he formed the largest faction in the Reichstag. The latest electoral strategies were employed, made possible by the support of big business. For instance, Lufthansa provided the passenger plane that allowed Hitler to travel around Germany, speaking at rallies in multiple cities on the same day. However, the influence of the NSDAP was nearing its peak. In the autumn elections, the party received 2 million fewer votes than in the summer. Various explanations were offered for this decline, but it was clear that the period of rapid growth was behind them. Concurrently, financial difficulties emerged. In a state of euphoria over their success, Hitler did not see the necessity of allying with conservative factions, which concerned many of his sponsors. the latter remained skeptical of the Nazi movement, viewing it as too radical. Business elites believed that this radicalism could be mitigated through an alliance with traditional right-wing parties, which would keep Hitler in check. Nonetheless, the NSDAP remained the only major force capable of opposing the communists, who were steadily increasing their influence among the masses. Thus, in the autumn of 1932, aging President Paul von Hindenburg received numerous appeals from businessmen urging that Hitler be entrusted with governmental responsibilities. It was suggested that the cabinet should not consist solely of Nazis. Conservatives should also be included. The illusion that Hitler could be controlled persisted strongly. A particularly significant petition reached the chancellery of the president on November 19th, signed by key figures in the German economy, including Thyssen, Schröder, Schacht, Reinhardt, the director of Commerzbank, potash magnate Rosterg, and Kalkreith, the chairman of the Junkers Union, Landbund. These appeals inevitably influenced Hindenburg, who had previously regarded Hitler with disdain and had famously stated he could only appoint this upstart as Minister of Posts. Ultimately, under pressure from various political and economic elite groups, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Reich Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, a day that would later be regarded as one of the darkest in German history. Were the calculations of the captains of the German economy justified after Hitler ascended to power? This question is difficult to answer definitively. On one hand, the hope that Hitler could be controlled proved to be an illusion. The newly appointed Reich Chancellor swiftly discarded the oversight of conservatives and seized total control. State intervention in the economy became significant. By the mid-1930s, substantial structural changes were implemented that centralized key industries and introduced elements of economic planning. However, these changes largely aligned with the interests of big business, and many had been prepared by it. The General Council of the German economy, established in 1933, primarily consisted of industrial leaders. Hitler effectively eliminated the Red Threat in one decisive move, putting an end to class struggle. Strikes were banned, and business owners were declared Führers, to whom the workforce was obliged to submit unconditionally. Massive state orders, particularly for military purposes, invigorated the economy. Profits surged for enterprises, while unemployment rapidly declined. By the late 1930s, the economic crisis was remembered as a nightmare. The business elite did not remain passive. In June 1933, under the leadership of Krupp, a fund for gifts to Hitler was established, through which large donations were funneled to the National Socialists. Over the next 11 years, at least 700 million marks passed through this fund. The interests of Hitler and the industrialists began to diverge significantly only in the war's final months, when Hitler issued the Scorched Earth Order, mandating the destruction of all industrial facilities in areas abandoned to the enemy. Unlike many of his brutal orders, this directive was largely sabotaged, further evidencing the strong and independent position of the business elite within the Third Reich. Does this imply, as some historians suggest, that Hitler was merely a tool of large capital? Certainly not. The alliance between the National Socialists and the business elite was one of equals and, to some extent, compelled by circumstances, as neither side had a serious alternative to cooperation. The German business elite sought a strong state that respected private property and could create favourable conditions for economic growth. In simpler terms, they wanted assurance that their property would not be taken and that it would generate profit. Achieving this did not necessitate radical measures. Business could thrive within a stable, democratic system of the Western type. During the period of relative economic growth in the late 1920s, Businesses primarily supported the systemic parties of the right and centre-right, just as they now support the CDU-CSU bloc, Christian Democratic Union of Germany, and the Christian Social Union. The challenge was that stability during the Weimar period was the exception rather than the norm. The short history of the Republic began and ended with deep economic, social, and political crises. The system exhibited a clear inability to manage these crises, exacerbated by the widespread perception among the populace that it was an alien imposition associated with Germany's defeat in World War I and the humiliating Versailles Treaty. Consequently, radical parties, both right and left, gained traction during these crisis years. Many industrialists and financiers in post-war Germany were also indifferent toward the Republic. They nostalgically recalled the good old days of the Kaiser era, when a strong central government guaranteed stability and protected the interests of the German economy, including on the international stage. Business circles primarily sympathized with conservative factions. However, neither the German nationalists led by Hugenberg, nor the liberals, nor the Centre Party could guarantee stability. In the early 1930s, their influence over voters steadily declined, and the substantial subsidies provided by German businesses merely slowed this decline rather than reversing it. It became evident that victory in elections could not be achieved solely with money. A force was needed that could protect business interests while leading the masses. The National Socialists emerged as that force. In reality, it is unlikely that many of the captains of the economy were genuine and fervent supporters of Hitler. For these elite individuals, who viewed themselves as superior to the masses, it was challenging not to look down on a street orator with a distinctive moustache. It is no coincidence that most of them believed they could easily manipulate Hitler and use him as a tool. The fact that this former corporal proved to be more complex than they anticipated came as an unpleasant surprise to many in the traditional elite. Initially, it seems that Hitler and his party were meant to play a supporting role, attracting radical voters to the right wing. However, the global economic crisis and the elections of 1930 disrupted those plans. The weight that the NSDAP had gained rendered it impossible to consider them a junior partner. From 1930 onward, many business representatives began to place their main bets on the National Socialists, still believing they could impose their will on Hitler regarding key issues. Indeed, in the context of a political crisis, with the National Socialists and Communists being the only two parties gaining voter support, it appeared to many that there was no alternative. Business was determined to prevent a communist victory at all costs. Thus, they felt compelled to support Hitler. By the early 1920s, the future Führer understood that without the backing of existing elites, he would not ascend to power. In his speeches to Munich beer hall audiences and unemployed stormtroopers, he could denounce the capitalists profiting from the common man's suffering. However, this was mere rhetoric. When addressing small gatherings of the business elite, Hitler expressed entirely different sentiments. He skillfully utilized the subsidies he received from large corporations to amplify his influence among voters while using the support of those voters to influence the captains of the economy. With a mixture of respect and envy for the wealthy and successful, Hitler was by no means a simple tool in their hands. He aimed for an equal and mutually beneficial alliance. Ultimately, such an alliance was forged. Both parties benefited. Hitler achieved power, while the business elite secured the conditions necessary for their prosperity. Nevertheless, it cannot be claimed that one party was able to subjugate the other entirely. Even until the very end, Big Capital retained a high degree of independence within the Third Reich, a level of autonomy unmatched by any other interest group. After the war, when the Third Reich, along with its Führer, became history, the captains of the economy who supported Hitler largely evaded responsibility for the crimes of National Socialism and continued to operate successfully in the new democratic Germany. It is doubtful that their worldview underwent a significant transformation. Chapter 8. The Crazy German Leader, Narcissism and Paranoia. The accusation that Hitler was mentally unstable, often referred to as the crazy Führer, has become a prominent idea among historians, journalists, and even some of Hitler's former associates. One such person was Heinz Guderian, one of Hitler's favoured generals, who wrote in his Memoirs of a Soldier, "The German people should know that the man who stood at its head, the man whom they trusted more than any leader, was a sick man. His illness became his misfortune, his fate, and also the misfortune and fate of his people." There are several reasons why this narrative of Hitler's madness emerged. First, it served as a way to further vilify one of history's most notorious figures, attributing as many negative traits to him as possible, including mental instability. Second, it plays into the myth of demonic possession, which is often contrasted with the notion of occult power. Historically, madmen were seen as being under the influence of supernatural forces, whether good, like holy fools, or evil. This concept of madness as a form of possession has been reflected even by religious figures. For example, Father Gabriele Amorth, the Vatican's chief exorcist under Pope Benedict XVI, once stated that both Hitler and Stalin were possessed by the devil. According to documents recently released by the Vatican, Pope Pius XIII even attempted to perform an exorcism on Hitler during World War II. However, as Father Amorth noted, it is extremely difficult to perform an exorcism remotely, and it requires the possessed person to be present and willing to be freed of the evil spirit. Another significant reason why Hitler was accused of being mad, especially by German authors, is that it provides a convenient explanation for the horrors of the Third Reich. If Hitler was truly insane, then his thoughts and actions were simply the result of his sick mind, disconnected from the prevailing ideas and sentiments of the time. For example, his anti-Semitism could be seen as a manifestation of his mental illness, rather than a product of the deep-rooted European anti-Semitism of the late 19th century. This interpretation conveniently places all the responsibility for the regime's atrocities on Hitler, absolving others who were involved in implementing his policies. However, this approach ignores the fact that it wasn't Hitler alone who carried out these crimes. He did not personally smash the windows of Jewish shops on Kristallnacht or build concentration camps. So, did Hitler suffer from mental illness? To answer this, we must first recognize that almost every individual has some form of psychological deviation. Psychologists and psychiatrists often argue that no one is entirely free of psychological trauma, phobias, or obsessions, which others might simply see as character traits. In this sense, it could be argued that Hitler had psychological deviations, just like the majority of people. The more pertinent question is what those deviations were, and to what extent they influenced his thinking and actions. One possible explanation for Hitler's psychological state is post-traumatic stress syndrome, PTSD, a disorder that can arise after exposure to extreme situations, such as combat. Erich Maria Remarque, one of the most famous chroniclers of the psychological effects of war, vividly describes the impact on soldiers forced to kill and how it alters their ability to reintegrate into civilian life. PTSD often manifests in stages, including immediate acute stress, delayed reactions, and long-term symptoms like insomnia, aggression, and an altered perception of reality. these symptoms can last a lifetime. While Hitler was older than most soldiers during World War I, he still experienced the psychological trauma of combat. However, to label him crazy solely because of this trauma would be to similarly indict millions of other veterans. PTSD alone is not sufficient to explain Hitler's behaviour. Aside from PTSD, Hitler was also given various psychiatric diagnoses, many of which are speculative or based on psychoanalytic theories. However, two diagnoses seem more widely accepted: Narcissism and Paranoia. Narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by grandiosity, a lack of empathy, a need for admiration, and aggressive responses to criticism. Narcissists often display a grandiose sense of self-importance and a belief in their own uniqueness and exceptionalism, while masking deep feelings of insecurity. Hitler's upbringing and failures in his artistic career likely contributed to this sense of inferiority, which he compensated for through his grandiose vision of himself as a messianic figure destined to lead the German people. Hitler often compared himself to historical and religious figures, including Christ, Napoleon, and Frederick the Great. He even spoke of National Socialism as a religion and portrayed himself as a savior. He believed he had a divine mission to make Germany great. His associate, Joachim von Ribbentrop, stated after Hitler's death that he was convinced of his role as a messiah, destined by Providence itself. Hitler's obsession with maintaining his public image was another manifestation of his narcissism. He meticulously rehearsed speeches and gestures, even practicing in front of a mirror. His valet, Heinz Linger, noted that Hitler always wore glasses to read, but would never allow himself to be seen wearing them in public, as it would contradict his self-image. Hitler also typed his speeches in large font to avoid needing glasses, but he often instinctively reached for them during public appearances. A key trait of narcissistic personality disorder is the denial of personal responsibility for failures. Hitler was notorious for blaming others when things went wrong. According to Guderian, Hitler always sought scapegoats for military defeats, never accepting that he might have made mistakes. Another feature of narcissism is rage, which Hitler demonstrated frequently. His public speeches were filled with aggression, and he had violent outbursts in private. Though these fits of rage were not constant, they were a marked departure from his usual demeanour, suggesting a deep lack of self-control. Rage in narcissists is often tied to the fear of their fragile ego collapsing. Criticism or opposition can trigger a furious reaction, as it threatens the grandiose self-image that the narcissist has constructed. Hitler's paranoia, particularly regarding disloyalty among his inner circle, exacerbated this. He reacted with extreme hostility when he felt betrayed, as in the case of his former associate, Gregor Strasser, who refused to support him in 1933. Some accounts of Hitler's furious reaction even claim that he rolled on the floor in rage, although this has likely been exaggerated. In conclusion, while it is clear that Hitler exhibited traits of narcissistic personality disorder and paranoia, it would be overly simplistic to attribute all of his actions to mental illness. His behavior was influenced by a combination of personal pathology and the social, political, and ideological currents of his time. The attempt to reduce Hitler to a madman overlooks the wider context of the horrors of the Third Reich and the complicity of many others in carrying out its crimes. Here's a revised version of the text to improve clarity, grammar, coherence, and terminology. Another sign of narcissism is a lack of empathy, the ability to sympathize with others. Throughout his life, Hitler avoided normal human intimacy. His personal sphere remained closed, even to his closest associates. Ribbentrop later recalled, "I experienced much with him, but I did not become closer to him on a human level than on the first day of our acquaintance, despite working with him for years. Something in his nature kept me from personal intimacy." Guderian similarly noted in his memoirs, "He had a fatal flaw, an isolation, a solitude of spirit. He had no real friends. Even his old party comrades were merely associates, not friends." As far as I know, Hitler did not maintain friendly relations with anyone, nor did he ever share his innermost thoughts with anyone. Just as he could not make friends, he could not passionately love a woman. He walked alone through life, obsessed with his grand plans. We have already discussed the woman in Hitler's life, but he truly had no friends during Guderian's time with him. The only possible exception was Goering, though this is questionable. "I am not aware of any friendships with him. He was a very withdrawn person," recalled Johanna Wolff, Hitler's personal secretary from 1929. Narcissistic personalities, feeling a sense of self-importance, often deny the ethical norms that they believe are only for ordinary people. They live by the principle that the end justifies the means and see lying and breaking rules as acceptable. This is true of Hitler. After his victory over France, Hitler's narcissism reached unprecedented heights. In a conversation with a party functionary, he claimed to be the first and only mortal to ascend to the status of a Superman, considering himself not so much a human as a divine being, above the law and not bound by human morality. Otto Dietrich, State Secretary of Goebbels' propaganda ministry, later wrote, "When choosing his methods, Hitler lacked any sense of good or evil. He had no moral compass." Toward the end of the war, according to Speer, Hitler deliberately wanted people to perish with him. For him, moral boundaries no longer existed. The end of his life meant the end of everything. Narcissistic personalities may fall into temporary depression when their plans fail, but this depression is often short-lived, disappearing when conditions allow them to resume their activities. Hitler displayed depressive reactions on several occasions, including suicide attempts, after the failure of the Munich Putsch in 1923, and in 1931 following the suicide of his niece, Gaily Raubal. Similarly, he exhibited a 2-week refusal to eat after his imprisonment in the Landsberg fortress and suicidal thoughts following the NSDAP's electoral failure on November 6, 1932, which coincided with Eva Braun's suicide attempt. However, these depressions were short-lived, and Hitler always returned to political activity. Hitler was also plagued by health anxieties, likely stemming from psychosomatic symptoms such as stomach colic, excessive sweating, and limb tremors. His stomach pains would flare up during moments of stress, both positive, such as the Anschluss of Austria, and negative, such as the occupation of the Rhineland or Czechoslovakia. During these moments, the pain was so severe that Hitler drafted his will, but the pain would subside as soon as the situation improved. He believed these symptoms were the onset of cancer and had an exaggerated fear of contracting syphilis or other infectious diseases. This hypochondria likely mirrored his attitudes toward Jews, whom he described as parasites, bacilli, plague, and virus, among other terms. However, these health anxieties may also indicate a second mental disorder, paranoia. Paranoid personality disorder is characterized by overvalued or delusional ideas, suspicion, distrust, and stubbornness, traits that Hitler displayed in abundance. His policy was shaped by 4 interconnected overvalued ideas: the greatness of Germany, the fight against the Jews, the destruction of Bolshevism, and the conquest of living space in the East. His anti-Semitism, in particular, went beyond an overvalued idea. It was a delusional belief in a worldwide Jewish conspiracy. Similarly, Hitler believed that the USSR, or Asia, as he sometimes called it, sought to enslave Europe. This conviction led him to dismiss objective arguments about the political and military situation. The fight against the Bolshevization of Europe became a central part of his messianic vision. This delusional worldview drove many of Hitler's decisions, such as his involvement in the Spanish Civil War, which strained relations with England. It also led to the anti-Comintern pact with Japan, despite concerns within Germany about the racial aspects of such an alliance. Hitler's refusal to negotiate with Stalin during the war stemmed from this same ideological fixation. In the fight against Bolshevism, there can be no compromise, Ribbentrop recalled Hitler saying. Hitler's pathological hatred of Jews consumed his political career. As early as 1922, he promised that after coming to power, he would order the hanging of Jews on Munich's Marienplatz, continuing until there were none left. In Mein Kampf, Hitler described his policy towards Jews in terms of extermination, believing that by doing so, he was serving a divine cause. According to Hitler, a worldwide Jewish center with branches in Moscow, Paris, London, and New York was systematically coordinating the Bolshevization of the world. Hitler's paranoia also manifested in his relationships. He was deeply distrustful of those around him. The Supreme Commissioner of Danzig from the League of Nations, Karl Burghardt, wrote in the early 1930s, "He does not trust anyone or anything, suspecting everyone of contact with the enemy." Guderian also noted that Hitler trusted no general. Ribbentrop described him as incomprehensibly distrustful, and Speer claimed distrust was Hitler's vital element. An example of this paranoia was the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, when Hitler eliminated the leadership of the Stormtroopers, SA. Officially, this was framed as the suppression of a dangerous conspiracy. Whether Hitler truly believed in the threat of a second revolution from Rome, or whether this was a signal to the army and industrial leaders that they could work with Nazism, remains debated. Nevertheless, the episode illustrates Hitler's growing paranoia. Hitler's stubbornness was another well-known trait. Ribbentrop described his inability to tolerate objections, stating, "His intractability was such that one could easier move Mont Blanc than get Hitler to abandon a decision." Hitler's mental and physical conditions deteriorated after significant failures, such as Stalingrad. Guderian, who met with him after that defeat, described Hitler as visibly changed, with shaking hands, a hunched posture, and a frozen gaze. His deterioration accelerated after the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, leading Guderian to note, "His mental balance was permanently disturbed. His mistrust turned to hatred, his bluffing to mendacity. He lied often, sometimes unaware, and trusted no one." Even Goebbels, who was always loyal to Hitler, lamented in 1945, "The Führer's lucky star has abandoned him. If someone who hadn't seen him in 2 or 3 years saw him now, they would be shocked. Not only has he aged, but he has lost his initiative and can no longer make rapid, intuitive decisions." So, was Hitler mentally ill? Not necessarily. Narcissism and paranoia are not equivalent to schizophrenia. However, Hitler clearly exhibited significant personality disorders that affected his decision-making. To understand his actions, these disorders must be considered. Could a completely normal person, devoid of mental deviations, have risen to the heights that Hitler did? Probably not. His blind confidence in his destiny likely fueled his persistence in pursuing his goals. While his narcissism and paranoia undoubtedly shaped his thinking, it would be an exaggeration to say that Germany was ruled by a madman, at least in the strict medical sense. Chapter 9. the Slavs, subhumans in Hitler's vision. Among the stories about how Hitler missed the chance to win World War II, one often stands out. The claim that his irrationally negative attitude towards the Slavs was a key reason for Germany's defeat. According to this narrative, it was this hatred that alienated the Russians, many of whom, weary of Stalin's terror, initially welcomed the German troops as liberators. This supposed missed opportunity led to the Russian people rallying around Stalin, despite their hatred for him, resulting in the eventual defeat of the Third Reich. Had Hitler treated the Russians humanely from the outset, some argue many Russians would have sided with Germany, and the Soviet regime would have collapsed much sooner. However, since my book focuses on debunking myths about Hitler, other questions seem more relevant. Was Hitler's attitude towards the Slavs truly irrational? And was it atypical for Germans at the time? Furthermore, was there a significant difference between Hitler's views and those of the German military regarding the Soviet population? My first point, which may surprise some readers, is that Hitler's hatred for the Slavs was not as intense as his hatred for the Jews. For Hitler, Jews represented the core of global evil and the greatest threat to the German people, allegedly seeking to destroy the Aryan race. In contrast, Slavs, particularly Russians, were merely one of many inferior races, no better or worse than, say, the Chinese or Africans. This is evidenced in Mein Kampf, where Hitler dedicates far fewer pages to the Russians compared to his extensive diatribes against the Jews. His main stance regarding Russia can be summarized as follows. When thinking about the conquest of new territories in Europe, naturally, Russia comes to mind. Fate itself has pointed us in that direction. By handing Russia over to Bolshevism, fate deprived the Russian people of the intelligentsia upon which their statehood depended. This Germanic element alone had given the Russian state its strength and stability. Russia owes its existence not to the Slavic peoples, but to the Germanic core at the top of its society. This is an excellent example of the state-building role the Germanic race has historically played within inferior races. Powerful states have been created throughout history when peoples of lower culture were led by Germans. Hitler adds, "The end of Jewish rule in Russia will also be the end of Russia as a state, and fate has destined us to witness this catastrophe, confirming the correctness of our racial theory. Our mission must not involve repeating the campaigns of Alexander, but in opening up new lands for German colonization." In other words, for Hitler, the subjugation of Russia was not personal, it was just business. Germany needed living space, and if the Slavic population was deemed surplus, so be it. It's also important to understand that Hitler's views on the Slavs were not uniquely his own. Generations of Germans had been raised with a similar disdain for Slavs, particularly Russians. This attitude can be traced back to the early Middle Ages, when Germanic tribes expanded eastward, displacing and exterminating Slavic tribes, such as the Prussians. The Teutonic Knights, with their crusades into Slavic lands, aimed to convert the pagan Slavs or annihilate them. Though there were occasional setbacks, like in 1242 when a Slavic prince famously defeated the Teutonic Knights on a frozen lake, these were seen as minor and insignificant in the grand scheme of German expansion. The perception of Russia as a backward, barbaric country persisted for centuries. Even Peter the Great's reforms did little to change this view. The rise of the Russian Empire was attributed not to the Slavs themselves, but to the influence of foreigners brought into Russian service. The so-called Norman theory, which claimed that Slavs were incapable of founding their own state and had to rely on Scandinavian princes like Rurik, was regarded as an indisputable truth in European academia. According to this view, Russia's ruling elite was essentially European in blood, and without them, Russia would not have survived as a state. By the 19th century, one might have expected the Enlightenment to dispel such national prejudices, but this was not the case. When Russian troops entered Germany to liberate it from Napoleon, they were seen not as allies, but as wild Cossacks who needed to leave civilized Europe as quickly as possible. A few decades later, Germans eagerly consumed the works of the French aristocrat de Custine, who expressed disdain for the Russian people. Skeptics even claimed that a Neanderthal skull found in the Neander Valley belonged to a Russian Cossack. While Russian cultural figures like Turgenev and Dostoevsky were respected in Germany, this was because they were seen as part of the intellectual elite, distinct from the masses of the Russian population. In fact, many Russian nobles shared this view, believing themselves to be racially and culturally superior to the common folk. By 1871, the newly unified German Empire held a broad public consensus regarding Russia. It was a cruel, backward nation. Friedrich Engels, one of the pillars of European socialism, wrote that the Slavs were not vital and incapable of achieving independence. Even liberal Germans held similar views, seeing Russia as a land of slavery and barbarism. Conservatives, while slightly more favourable due to monarchical solidarity with the Romanovs, who were practically German by blood, held similarly negative views of the Russian people. The negative attitude towards Russia persisted into the 20th century. During World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II sent satirical postcards to his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, mocking Russia as a monstrous pigsty that needed to be civilized. Russian soldiers entering East Prussia at the beginning of the war encountered terrified locals who had been led to believe that the Russians were cannibals. This hostility culminated in 1915, when nearly 1,500 leading German intellectuals signed a memorandum urging that Western Russian lands be colonized by Germans and the Slavic population deported. These ideas would later find an echo in Hitler's General Plan Ost. Given this historical context, it's no surprise that Hitler regarded Slavs as subhumans. However, his attitude was pragmatic rather than purely hateful, in contrast to his obsession with the Jews. Slavic lands, in Hitler's view, were to be Germanized, with their populations either enslaved or exterminated. A few million Slavs could remain as a labor force, while the rest would be forced to move east or perish. Those who remained would face a grim fate. The conduct of German soldiers in the Soviet Union reflected this attitude. Letters from the front reveal the brutality of the occupation. One example comes from the diary of Private Emil Goltz, who in June 1941 wrote, "We passed Baranovichi. The city is destroyed, but there's more to be done. On the road from Mir to Stolpcy, we spoke to the population with machine guns. Screams, groans, blood and corpses. No compassion. In every village I want to shoot into the crowd." Similarly, Private Walter Trav wrote home, "The hour of reckoning has come. We'll exterminate the Jews, regardless of age or gender. In the East, we must be true Vikings, showing no mercy to inferior races." While not all German soldiers were sadists, such cruelty was widespread, reflecting a deeply ingrained belief in Slavic inferiority that predated Hitler. Even when the tide of the war turned, and Germany began recruiting Russians into the Wehrmacht and SS, this didn't signify any fundamental shift in Nazi racial policy. It was simply a pragmatic decision. If subhumans were willing to kill each other, why not let them? Hitler's Slavic policy remained unchanged until the end. Chapter 10. Escape or Death? Hitler's Final Hours. One of the most well-documented and significant events of 20th century history is Adolf Hitler's suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin on April 30th, 1945. The testimony of witnesses has been examined in detail, and we know much about both the act of suicide and the subsequent fate of Hitler's remains. At the same time, one of the most enduring myths of the 20th century is that of Hitler's miraculous escape. Over the 65 years since the war ended, journalists have proposed countless theories. Some claim he escaped via submarine or plane, while others suggest a double was present in Berlin. There are even tales of him living in a Catholic monastery in Europe, in Latin America, or at a secret base in Antarctica. Alleged sightings of him persisted well into the 1950s, 1960s, and even 1970s. In this context, it is useful to remember the reality of the situation. As the war was hopelessly turning against him, Hitler moved his headquarters to Berlin on April 1st, 1945. It was in this underground bunker beneath the old Imperial Chancellery that he spent his final days. Soviet and Western filmmakers have often exaggerated these last days, depicting scenes of chaotic orgies, drunkenness, and complete disintegration of control. However, it can be confidently stated that such portrayals are exaggerated artistic interpretations. In reality, the bunker maintained a level of discipline similar to that found at any of Hitler's headquarters. What had changed was Hitler himself. Physically flabby and seemingly aged overnight, he evoked feelings of pity rather than fear or respect from those around him. All he had worked to achieve had crumbled. To him, those he had once considered his closest allies now appeared as traitors. The situation at the front was changing rapidly, often outpacing the reports he received. Hitler sought to stay informed, spending hours over giant battle maps, moving colourful pins to represent units that often did not exist at the time of the report. His life had become increasingly detached from reality. His secretary, Gertrude Traudl-Junger, once tactlessly asked, "Don't you think the German people expect you to lead the troops and die in battle?" He replied with a grim acknowledgement of his frailty, "My hands are shaking. I can hardly hold the pistol." Among those he could still rely on, only Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels remained. Alongside them in the bunker were the chief of the general staff, Krebs, secretaries, adjutants, and guards. Hitler, despite being only 56 years old, appeared as a decrepit old man, utterly exhausted. By April 26th, 3/4 of Berlin had already been occupied by Soviet troops. The reason for Hitler's continued existence is unclear. He could no longer change the outcome of the war and refused to flee. Arthur Axmann had invited him to escape Berlin, protected by the Hitler Youth, but he declined. Offers to evacuate in a fighter plane were also rejected. Officially, he placed his hopes on the Ninth Army, commanded by General Wenck, and on the SS tank units led by Steiner. However, neither Wenck nor Steiner had any chance of reaching Berlin, much less stopping the advance of the Soviet tank armies. Hitler's state was paradoxical. On one hand, he deluded himself with the hope of a miraculous turnaround in the fighting, akin to the last-minute salvation Frederick the Great experienced with the death of Russian Empress Elizabeth Petrovna and the subsequent accession of Peter III, which caused Russian troops to halt their advance and even side with the Prussians. Interestingly, Hitler and his inner circle also sought to draw parallels to the death of American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt on April 26th. On the other hand, many of Hitler's actions appeared quite rational. He clearly planned his own suicide, issued orders, and distributed ampules of poison to those without them in anticipation of capture by the Soviets. His decision to open the Spree floodgates reflected his determination. As a result, metro stations seized by Soviet troops flooded, and German soldiers, women, children, and civilians hiding from bombings drowned. Hitler showed little concern. He, accustomed to feeling like a demigod, believed that with his death, Germany would cease to exist. This was how he envisioned it. April 29th was perhaps the most significant day Hitler spent in the Berlin bunker. He made the final decision to leave this life, but first needed to finalize earthly matters. This included paying tribute to Eva Braun, who had been by his side for so long, and writing a will. At a depth of 8 meters underground, Hitler and Eva Braun were married in a ceremony that unfolded with a certain deliberation, as required by law. The witnesses were Goebbels and Bormann. Eva signed the marriage contract for the first and last time in her life, as Eva Hitler. Following the ceremony, there was a small banquet, a pale shadow of the lavish feasts held in the Reich Chancellery, or the Wolf's Lair in better times. Hitler attended only briefly, leaving to write his will. The next day, at Hitler's command, his personal chauffeur, Kempka, delivered 200 litres of gasoline to the garden of the Reich Chancellery, stating that this was all that was available. In the conference room, Hitler and Eva bid farewell to the remaining inhabitants of the bunker before departing. What happened next remains unknown. No one witnessed the couple's suicide. According to one account based on the testimony of Hitler's personal valet, Linger, Hitler and Eva shot themselves. In this version, when Linger and Bormann entered the room, Hitler was found slumped on a sofa with blood flowing from his right temple, and Eva lay dead in the corner, her revolver on the floor. It is worth recalling that Hitler had complained about his shaking hands, expressing doubt about being able to hold the gun. Another version, which is surprisingly more popular among historians, claims that Hitler and Eva poisoned themselves with potassium cyanide. Before his death, Hitler also poisoned his beloved German Shepherd. This account may be more widely accepted because it offers a more shameful death for a monster and tyrant. After all, there is something undeniably heroic about a bullet to the temple, whereas death by poison carries the connotation of cowardice. A third version suggests that Hitler shot himself, while Eva took poison. The conclusion remains the same. No one knows for certain what transpired. No one witnessed the suicide, and significant discrepancies exist in the descriptions of the scene immediately after. This uncertainty fuels the myth of his miraculous escape. Later, Bormann ordered the bodies to be wrapped in blankets, taken outside, and burned. Due to insufficient gasoline, the bodies did not incinerate properly, and ultimately, they were buried in a shell crater. Strangely, they were not buried, but merely placed in the ground with their legs sticking out. Given that the burial team consisted of SS soldiers, this behaviour seems peculiar. Devoted to their Führer, they offered him neither the honours due nor a proper burial. This often confounds proponents of the miraculous escape theory. They argue that, from a propaganda standpoint, there is a reasonable explanation. The SS soldiers, despite their disillusionment, would not abandon their sense of loyalty and honour. Even in the Third Reich's last days, they assert, the Guard remains loyal. However, it is overlooked that the romantic image of the SS Knights, which had been crafted in the 1930s and to some extent reflected reality in the early war years, had significantly faded by the time of defeat. Recruitment standards had deteriorated. Nearly anyone was taken into the once elite troops, including foreigners, who, according to the racial doctrine of National Socialism, were categorized as subhumans, Asians, blacks, and Slavs. The bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun were discovered on May 4th by a Red Army soldier, Churakov. They remained unexamined until May 8th, when they were transported to a Berlin morgue for identification. An external examination suggested that the remains belonged to Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. While Braun's identification was uncertain, Hitler certainly had multiple doubles. By May 1945, rumours of Hitler being discovered alive or dead circulated widely, fueled by the feverish search for criminal number one. However, Hitler's court dentist, Geiserman, confirmed that the jaws of the corpse matched Hitler's dental records, yet this did not rule out the possibility of a provocation involving dummy bodies. Eva's body was identified only by the gold bridge of her lower jaw. Numerous strange moments arose during the identification process. Soviet Marshal Zhukov announced on May 6th, before the war's end, that Hitler's body had been found. 3 days later, he referred to it as presumptive. Foreign experts offering assistance were denied access to the remains. All identification procedures in the summer of 1945 were conducted independently. Over the following months, the remains of Hitler, Eva Braun, and the Goebbels family were reburied 7 times, eventually finding their seemingly final resting place in the Magdeburg area in February 1946. After Hitler's death, numerous newspapers and reputable magazines published investigative articles about his miraculous survival. Some authors presented facts and witness testimonies claiming to have seen Hitler and Eva Braun in South America, particularly in Argentina. Others suggested they had found refuge on remote islands. However, all these so-called facts and testimonies lacked any real foundation. What is true is that at the end of World War II, the US government conducted a secret operation codenamed Paperclip. This operation aimed to bring elite Nazi engineers to America, resulting in the establishment of research centers and advanced weaponry development. Various right-wing and neo-Nazi groups continue to propagate conspiracy theories, believing that Hitler is still alive and operating from one of these secret bases. Such myths, however, have no factual basis. It is unlikely that a person in his position and situation would have survived for long, given that he had no support base, resources, or infrastructure at his disposal. While the real story of Hitler's last days continues to elicit public interest and analysis, the possibility of his escape serves more as a testament to human imagination than as a credible historical narrative. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you found it insightful, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay up to date with future episodes. Should you have any feedback or thoughts to share, feel free to leave a comment or contact me directly. I'd greatly appreciate your input.